Hey, what's up? This is Caleb Ward, and in this After Effects tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this cool Saturn space scene in After Effects. Awesome. So before we get going, I want to encourage you to go download the free project file over on my website at VFX City. That's vfx.city. You can find a link in the description of this video. So let's go ahead and create a new project. So just go to File, New Project, and we won't save this one. So let's create a new composition. I'm going to hit Command N, and we'll make it 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, and 5 seconds long. That's perfect. Hit OK. So first things first, let's create a new composition. So hit Command N for new composition, and the composition name will do Final Output. And we'll make sure the width is 1920, the height is 1080, and the duration is 5 seconds long. So click OK. So let's create a new solid. So we'll hit Command Y, or you can go to Layer, New Solid, and we'll make this solid black. And hit OK, and we'll make it comp size, and we'll just call it BG for background, and hit OK. This isn't actually going to do anything, it's just going to be completely still, and that's perfectly fine. So let's create the stars now. So hit Command Y, and we'll call this Layer Stars, and remember you can go to Layer, New Solid if you need to, and we'll make it 1920 by, we'll say 1920. We want to make it a square layer, and instead of black, let's set it to white. Hit OK and OK. So in order to create the stars, you could go to the star burst effect and do it by hand. So we're going to do it by hand for the sake of this tutorial. And I'm going to turn down the size. So we want the size to be pretty small. So now we're at about 20. And if you zoom in here, you can see there's just lots of different size stars, but it makes it look like the entire sky is full of stars. And that's exactly what we want. And let's go in and turn the speed to 0. Cool, so now it's completely still. If we scrub through our composition here, you can see that it doesn't move at all. So one thing that we're going to want to do in this tutorial is actually give the stars a little bit of color. So to do that, I'm going to type in glow in our effects browser, drag it over to the stars, and we'll set the glow colors to AB colors. So if you're familiar with astronomy, then you know that stars can be shifted into two different colors, red or blue, depending on if they're coming towards the Earth or away from it. So for our two colors, we're actually going to go ahead and choose red and blue. So color A, red, and color B, blue. And hit OK. So all we want to do is give it a slight colorization. So if there's not quite enough blue in there for you, you can grab this glow threshold, kind of bring it up just a little bit. And if you crank it up a lot, you can begin to see how there's a little bit of red. And so this blue is maybe a little bit of an off purple, but instead of really emphasizing that red, we're really just going to focus on the blue. So you can dial this down to whatever number you want. We can stick to maybe around 90. So just maybe about 10% of the stars have a blue tint to them. Cool. So now it's time to add in a little bit of dust to the background. So to do that, I'm going to hit Command Y, and we can call this layer dust, and it can be white, 1920 by 1920, and hit OK. And you probably guessed it, in order to create the dust, we're going to use the turbulent noise effect. So go ahead and type in turbulent noise and drag and drop it onto your layer. And let's go ahead and decrease the brightness. And so we just have this kind of dark dust here, and let's turn up the scale. We want the dust to be pretty big, maybe somewhere about there. And then we can use the offset turbulence property here, and we can just grab the little handle and move it around until we have the dust in a place that's good for us. And I kind of like this kind of white blob being over here. So that's looking good. All right, so now that our dust is where we want it, we're going to go to our effects browser and find the tint effect and drag it onto our layer. So let's go in and map the black. We're going to pick just kind of a dark purple, maybe somewhere about there, and hit OK. And then let's go to the white, and we're going to map this into kind of a peach color, so right about here, and hit OK. And obviously this is too bright and saturated, so I'm going to hit T for opacity, and we're going to turn down this property value to about 16. So now it's ever so slight, but if you zoom in here, you can see the dust kind of throughout our scene. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. Let's hit Command Y, and we'll call this new layer dust number 2, and it could be 1920 by 1920, and hit OK. And you guessed it, we're going to use the turbulent noise effect and just drag and drop it onto our scene here. So instead of adjusting any of these parameters here, I'm going to go to our transfer mode and set it to overlay. So now if we kind of cycle this on and off, you can see that there's a little more texture in the sky. And this is just helping to accentuate the kind of organic and random nature of our scene. So I'm going to go in here and just kind of turn up the evolution just so we get something a little different than the dust below it. And I'm going to duplicate the dust number 2. So now we have literally 2 layers that are exactly the same. And obviously I'm going to change the name here from dust number 2 to dust number 3. And for this one, we're going to set the transfer mode to add. So right off the bat, you can see that it is way too bright. So what I'm going to do is select our pen tool here at the top. You can hit the G key for a keyboard shortcut. And I'm just going to kind of cut out just a random shape here in the side. And I'm going to feather it out. Hit the F key and just feather it out right about there. And now that we've done that, I'm going to hit T for opacity and turn the value down. We'll turn it down to about 25, so right about there. So now you can see that our scene has this organic space dust to it. And if you wanted to, you could turn down the opacity even a little bit more, and perhaps you want to turn up the feathering. But the goal is just realism, you know, and really whatever you want your scene to look like. But I think for the purposes of our tutorial, this is looking perfect. Now it's time to create the rings. Now, you're going to be blown away at how easy it is to create 3D Saturn rings in After Effects. But in order to do that, we're actually going to bring in a little bit of help. So in the project file folder from the download at VFX City, you'll see that there's a footage folder and an assets folder. Go ahead and grab both of those images and drop them into the project panel. So now we have the Saturn map, that's the map of the planet, and Saturn's rings. So before we go any further, let's create a new composition. I'm going to go to Composition, New Composition, and we're going to call this Saturn Rings. And I'm going to deselect the checkbox here, and we're going to make the width 4096, which is the 4K width, by 4096. And we can make it 5 seconds long, 24 frames per second, and hit OK. So now we have this really big composition. So what I'm going to do is drag down our Saturn ring texture. So right off the bat, you can see that it is not filling up this whole frame, but that's okay. If you hit Option Command F, it will, and you can actually go in and grab the very top here, the very top transform point, and just kind of drag it down to create kind of a skinny ring. And we're going to drag it down here to a little bit below the halfway point. And to help us out, I'm going to go to our little grid here, and I'm going to select the proportional grid. And we're just going to drag the shape of these rings just down here below this center point. And this will make a little more sense later, but for right now, just trust me, you want your rings to be about here in the scene. So what we're going to do is duplicate the rings, and we're going to go to our track mat and set it to Luma. So now if we toggle the transparency, you can see that the rings are see-through depending on the luminance values. So obviously Saturn's rings has some darkness to it, and right now we're only seeing the light parts of these rings. So what I'm going to do is make sure I have the layer on top selected, and I'm just going to kind of drag it up and scale it, and then kind of move it off just a little bit to where we have these kind of random stripes going through, and we're introducing some of the darker areas of Saturn's rings into the frame. Cool. So I'm going to turn off our proportional grid and create a new adjustment layer. So just go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And we're going to be using a really fun effect. It's called polar coordinates, and you can create a lot of interesting looks with polar coordinates, but the most useful part about using polar coordinates is the rect to polar feature. And this is essentially going to convert our square into a ring. And so obviously you can see where this would be very important. So go ahead and make sure that your type of conversion is set to rect to polar, and turn up the interpolation to 100%. And voila, you have a perfect ring. So let's go ahead and hop back into our final output composition, and let's go ahead and drag down the Saturn ring composition. So obviously it's too big, but what we're going to do is set it to 3D. So what I'm going to do is hit R for rotation and rotate it along the x-axis. So we're going to rotate it to where it's right about there. And let's go ahead and move it over in our scene using our little arms here. And we definitely want it to play a prominent role in our scene, but we don't want it to stand out quite this much. So I'm going to apply a curves effect. And this is one of the best color correction effects you can use. And I'm going to kind of bring up the light parts, but I'm going to make sure I keep the midtones right about the same. So we're just kind of emphasizing these highlights here. And I'm going to go to our effects browser again, and I'm going to type in hue and saturation and drag this down. And so now that we've gone in and pushed the highlights up a little bit, I'm going to adjust this lightness slider to bring the whole thing down evenly. So I'm just going to bring this down to about 70. So this is pretty dark, but this is going to look good for our final composition. And if you zoom in here, you can see the stars between the rings. So this is looking great. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Go to your effects browser, type in ramp, and drop it onto the rings. So obviously that color is all off, but I'm going to change the end color to kind of a middle of the road brown, maybe right about there, and hit OK. And let's turn on our blend with original, and we're going to just turn this up quite a bit. We're going to turn it up to maybe about 65, and we're going to grab our end of ramp color here, and we're going to just kind of move it around right about here, and then we'll adjust our start of ramp slider here, and we're just dragging it around just to give the entire set of rings a little more texture, and click away. All right, so that's how you create Saturn's rings. And now that the rings are created, let's create the actual planet itself. I'm going to create a new composition, and we're going to call this, you guessed it, Saturn. And we'll actually go to our HD preset, that's 1080, 24 frames per second. I'm going to lock the aspect ratio, and I'm actually going to double this entire composition by 2. So you can actually do math in the numbers window here. So if you do *2, it'll multiply the width and the height by 2. So we've created this UHD composition here, and hit OK. So go ahead and zoom out here to where we can see the entire composition and drop in the Saturn map. So as you can see, it's actually very small compared to the overall scene, and that's fine. If you hit Option Command F, your Saturn map will fill up the entire screen. And let's go ahead and drag in a CC sphere effect. So that's CC sphere, and go ahead and drag up the radius. We want the radius to be pretty big, right about there. And let's go to our shading, and we're going to turn up the ambient lighting to 100%. So now we have the flat ambient lighting, but we need to turn down all the other values. So let's turn down the diffuse to 0, the specular to 0, the roughness to 0, and then the metal to 0. So now we have this flat planet, and you'll kind of notice that this sphere is actually a little elongated here. So in order to fix that, you can just grab the edge and just drag it until it's a perfect circle. So right about there. And once you get your planet to where you want it, go to Layer Pre-Compose. And let's move all attributes to the new composition, and we'll call this new composition, we'll call it the Planet Texture, and hit OK. And let's go ahead and move this planet all the way to the side here, and we're going to go ahead and scale it up. It's right about there. And the color is all off. So instead of it being bright orange, I really want it to be a dark color. So I'm going to go to the levels effect, and I'm going to drop it onto the planet here. So go ahead and drag the lightness value here all the way down to right about maybe the last quarter to where it is pretty dark, so right about there. And go ahead and duplicate the planet. And for this next layer, and we have the top layer selected, go ahead and drag that slider back to the very top. And we're actually going to go ahead and grab this top slider here and drag it down to right about the same point. So you may be saying, Caleb, this is completely white, and you are correct. But this is important because we're actually going to try to create a reflection. So I'm going to go to our shape tool and select the ellipse, and I'm going to create an ellipse here, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and we're creating just a circle here, and then I'm going to hit V for the selection tool, or you can just select the little mouse tool here and just drag it down into your scene here to where essentially we want the reflection to be this corner here of the planet. So I'm just dragging it to a good point right about there, and I'm going to set the mask mode to subtract. So now the mask is subtracted, we have this reflection here, and so I'm going to go to our mask options here and just feather out the edge ever so slightly, so right about there, just to where the edge is feathered out, and I'm going to hit T and just turn down the brightness. It's maybe right about there, about 50%, and click away. And let's go ahead and select both of these planets here. Hit the R key for rotation and just kind of rotate it right about there. And now we're done creating the planet. So let's hop back into our final output and go to the project panel, and we can drag Saturn down into our scene. And let's go ahead and make Saturn 3D. And remember, we're going to want to scale it down because it is in 4K right now. So somewhere right about there. And then we can go ahead and adjust the rings as we need. And so we can bring the rings a little closer to maybe right about there. And then if you wanted to, you can go back in and adjust Saturn as you want. So we can double click inside of Saturn, and we can change the rotation to where it's not quite as much. Maybe we want to go in and darken up the planet just a little bit more to maybe right about there. And if you wanted to, you could even go into the mask for the reflection, and we can go ahead and select that mask, and we can drag it to where it's maybe only occupying a very small portion of the top screen. So let's go back to our final output, and this is looking pretty good. Again, you can customize this look as you see fit, so it really just depends on the type of Saturn you are trying to create. Now let's add some lights into our scene. The first thing we're going to do is go to Layer, New Solid, and we are going to select a kind of desaturated orangish color, maybe kind of like a pale orange right in there. Hit OK, and we can make it square, 1920 by 1920. That is fine. And the name, we'll call this Flare 1, and hit OK. So let's go to our ellipse tool here and hold down Shift, and we're just going to create a circle right in the center of our screen here. So I'm going to go to our title grid here and select the proportional grid, and then we can grab the edges of the circle just where they match up perfectly with the center here. And I'll go ahead and turn off the proportional grid. So when it comes to creating a sun, it really is about adding in a lot of different elements to each other to create a convincing effect. So I'm going to toggle the switches here, and I'm going to set the transfer mode to add, and we're going to hit F for feather. So we're going to feather out the edges of the sun, and I'm going to hit S to scale it down, and we're going to move it to, let's say, right about here. So we basically want the reflection to look like it's coming from the sun in the background. So let's go ahead and duplicate this flare layer, and we can scale down this duplicated layer, and let's duplicate it one more time and scale down that one even further. And so now we can go in and just scale these down as we see appropriate, so perhaps right about there. And this first flare, the largest of all three of the flares here, I'm going to turn it down. I'm going to hit T for opacity and turn down that value significantly, so maybe to where it's right about at 40%. And so if you zoom in here, you can see there's a bright sun and then just kind of this flare that comes off the sun. That's looking good. And let's go ahead and create another flare. So select the top one, duplicate it, and instead of making this one circle, I actually want it to be elongated. I want it to look like it is kind of a streak coming across the flare. In fact, let's go ahead and rename this flare streak so we don't get confused. And let's grab the edges and just kind of grab it and drag it off to right about there. And I'm going to hit T for opacity and bring it down just a little bit, maybe to about 55%. And hit R for rotation and just kind of rotate the streak. And hit Command D to duplicate it. Hit the R key and we're going to rotate it again, right about there. And do that one more time and hit the R key to rotate it. And we're going to create this cool six-sided star. It's right about there. Cool, so we actually don't want this to be on top of our Saturn layer. We want it to be below. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this down below our Saturn and ring texture. So now it's in the background back there. It's looking good. And let's go ahead and turn down the streak. So I'm going to select all of them, hit T for opacity, kind of turn it down a little bit, right about there. And then I'm going to select the flare in the middle, hit T, and turn down the opacity of that one too, maybe to about 50%. So it's all about just adjusting the opacities until you get something that you really like. And so we can even go in and perhaps we can make these streaks maybe different opacities. And you could even go in, perhaps you want to make one of the streaks a little more skinny than all the other ones. It's completely up to you, just whatever you decide is right for your scene. And let's go ahead and grab one of these streaks. Let's say this first streak and hit Command D to duplicate, and let's drag it to the very top. And I'm going to go to the rotation and set it to 0 and click away. So now it's completely horizontal here. You can see it goes left to right. And let's go ahead and drag the edges. So we're just going to grab these edges and just drag them out here, maybe to right about there. And I'm going to duplicate this streak one more time. And this time I want to drag the edges upward, right about here. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit and click away. So now we have some streaks on top and some streaks behind the planet. So let's go ahead and select both these streaks, hit Command T, and we're going to just bring down the saturation just a little bit. Cool, so this is looking good. It's a pretty convincing looking lens flare considering we made it by hand. So the last thing that I want to do is add in a little bit of a light leak into our scene. So I'm going to hit Command Y and we're going to create a bright orange solid. So about there, hit OK, and we'll call this Sun Glow. So I'm going to hit T for opacity, turn down the opacity, and then we're going to select the ellipse, and I'm going to just kind of make the ellipse about this big, just almost as big as that first flare that we made. I'm going to drag it over to about this portion here, and I'm going to hit F to feather it out. You can just go in and feather it out. And once you get it to about 130, go ahead and hit T, turn up the opacity, and then change the transfer mode to add. So now you can see that the scene looks like the sun is blending just a little more organically. And if you hit the F key, you can go in and just feather it out until the amount is right for you. And creating the lens flare is really that easy. All right, so now it's time to make our scene move. And it's actually not that difficult because we've really laid out a good framework for creating a cool 3D scene already. Remember, our ring's already in 3D space, our planet is already in 3D space, so really the only two objects that we need to worry about are the background and the lens flare. So before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and select all of our background elements except for our black solid, and I'm going to hit the 3D button. And right away you'll see that nothing has happened, and that's okay. What we're going to do is just push all of these elements back in 3D space, just a good distance. It's right about there, and then you can just grab the edge and scale them back up to where they fill the entire frame, and go ahead and click away. And so now our background's in 3D, our rings are in 3D, and our planet is in 3D. The only thing that's not in 3D is our lens flare. And we're actually going to keep that as a 2D object. We're just going to animate the position later. So what we're going to do is go to Layer, New Camera, and hit OK. And let's create a new null object. So go to Layer, New Null Object, set the null object to 3D, and pick whip onto the null. So what we did is we basically linked all of this camera's values to this null object. So if you move this null object, the camera will move with you. Pretty cool. So go ahead and move your playhead to the very beginning and set a keyframe for the position, the Y rotation, and the Z rotation. And let's go ahead and move to the 5-second mark and animate our scene. So let's go ahead and push the position in Z space quite a bit. In fact, I want to kind of move it up, and perhaps we want to move it a little to the left. And let's turn up the Z rotation. And perhaps we even want to turn up the Y rotation just a little, just to create this cool parallaxing with the background. So if we kind of scrub through here, you see there's this cool kind of angle that is produced from this movement. And I think this final scene, I actually want it to be maybe a little bit lower, maybe right about there. So that's our final keyframe, and that's our first keyframe. So it just creates this cool zooming effect. Cool, so you may be asking, why do my rings not blur out like the one found in the example video? So let's go ahead and make this ring look a little more realistic in our scene. So I'm gonna turn on the depth of field for our camera. So if you go to the camera here, go to the camera options and turn depth of field on, you'll begin to see that if you turn up the aperture, basically only portions of our scene will be in focus. And this is fine, but we really want more parts of our scene to be in focus than just the ring. So I'm gonna turn up the focus distance until our background is in focus. So we're just gonna keep cranking this up until the stars are nice and sharp. So for our scene right now, if we turn it up to about 6,000, it seems like the stars are in focus. And we can now go in and just turn down the aperture level to about, let's say, just something that makes sense for our scene, about 100. And then we can even go in and turn down the blur level just a little bit. Basically, we want this front part of the ring to be out of focus and the back part to be completely in focus. And so now if we scrub through, you can see this is just accentuating the scale of Saturn. One thing that definitely doesn't look right is the sun. You can imagine if the camera was rotating, then the sun flare should probably be rotating too. So we're gonna go into our sun streaks. Remember, this is the streak 1, 2, and 3. We're gonna go ahead and select them, hit the R key for rotation, set a keyframe. So go ahead and scrub to the end, make sure you have your streak selected, and hit the R key for rotation. And we're just going to rotate it just a little bit, maybe about 1/4 of a turn, right about there. So now if we scrub through, we can see that the flare just kind of rotates as the camera moves throughout the scene. And another thing that we're going to want to change is where the star is in the frame. So you can imagine that if the background is parallaxing that hard, the star should probably be moving just a little bit too. So I'm going to go in here and select all of our streaks, and this is the background star. And I'm going to go ahead and select all of our streaks, and we're going to parent them to the very first flare. And so now that we've parented them to this first flare, we can hit P for position, set a keyframe at the very beginning, scrub through just a little bit, and we can move this just kind of in 3D space, maybe to right about there, to where it looks like this star is just kind of tracking with the camera. Pretty cool. All right, so now it's the time you've been waiting for. We're gonna bring it all together and create an amazing composition. So the first things first, let's go ahead and try to create a moon, maybe over here in the upper left portion of our screen. So instead of creating a texture by hand, I can just bring in our planet texture layer. Remember, we created this planet texture earlier whenever we were creating the Saturn planet. So we can go ahead and scale this down. And because we're gonna darken this out, it doesn't really matter what the texture is. So we can go ahead and kind of move this over here, and let's go to the levels effect, and I already have it typed in here, and drag it onto this moon, and grab the kind of the bottom bar here and just drag it over to where you can just barely make out kind of this black edge here. And because it's so dark, you really can't tell that we used the Saturn planet texture. So go into the moon here and duplicate it. And just like we did for the planet, we're going to go ahead and drag up this slider here for the planet texture on top. And then we're going to drag this upper handle here to where we have this, basically this white ball in the sky. And I'm going to hit Shift-Command-C to pre-compose, and we'll call this Reflection Moon, and hit OK. And let's go to our ellipse tool here and just kind of cut out a portion of our scene where the reflection should be, so right about there. And I'm going to set the mask mode to subtract. We can kind of just move this to the edge right about there and hit F for feather. Just kind of feather it out just ever so slightly. We don't want it to be over the top, just something that is just kind of slight right about there. And we can just adjust the mask arms as we need. Cool. And click away. So let's go ahead and make sure that both the planet texture and the reflection is in 3D. So now if we kind of move through in 3D, the moon moves with it. And let's create a new black solid. So hit Command Y and we'll call this Moon Shadow. And we're going to set the color to black, hit OK, and OK. Now make sure that it's 3D and hit T for opacity. And we're going to go in and just kind of cut out where the shadow of the moon should be. So as you can imagine, if the sun is the source of the light, the shadow would be basically here to here and then down here to about there. So it's the shadow coming from the sun and hitting the moon. And if we click away, we can see that there's kind of this darker shadow, and that's looking pretty good. We can turn it up to about 30. And then let's go ahead and drop this moon shadow below the planet. So now we have, it's ever so slight, but you can kind of zoom in here. You can see that there's a dark black shadow there. So if you zoom in here, you can see the shadow moves in 3D space with the moon and just kind of makes it look realistic. Cool. So now let's go in and create a solid for the bottom here. I want the attention to kind of be drawn to this area and not as much this area. So I'm gonna hit Command Y and we're gonna create just a dark blue solid, something about like that. And we'll call this kind of blue corner and hit OK. And let's hit T for opacity and turn it down to about 30. And go to the pen tool here and cut out just a corner from the scene, just right about there, and hit F for feather and just feather it out. And we can just drag the arms here until it's covering a good portion of our scene, and hit T for opacity and turn it up to about 60, and let's make sure that it's set to 3D. So now we have this blue solid here in the corner, and it's just kind of drawing our eyes to the center here. So let's now go in and stylize the rings. So you would imagine that the rings, if they're right in front of the sun here, they would actually be really bright. So I'm going to go down to the Saturn ring layer, and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to set the transfer mode, if you hit the toggle switches button, to add. And when you do that, it's going to go ahead and make it pretty bright, but that's okay. We can now go in with our pen tool and just kind of cut out just a little chunk here right out of the top of our ring here and click away. And now you can see that we have this brighter area here, but obviously we don't want that line to be harsh. We want it to be feathered out. So if you select the top ring, hit the F key, you can feather out the bright rings here. Just kind of drag that arm. Cool. So now the rings are bright on that side, and then you would also anticipate that there would be a shadow on this side. So we can do the exact same thing. Go ahead and duplicate the bottom Saturn ring, and let's go ahead and turn down the lightness pretty significantly. We want it to be down at about, we'll say -90. And go ahead and select the pen tool, and remembering where the sun is, we're going to go ahead and just kind of cut out the bottom corner here. Just like this, yeah, make a square. And then we're gonna hit the F key for feathering and just kind of feather out the edge. And this one doesn't have to be quite as soft as the light, maybe right about there. This is just making it look like the rings are just kind of a little more in the shadow here. Cool, right about there. So if we scrub through, we can see that this actually moves in 3D space. That's looking pretty cool. And another thing I can see here is our Saturn is pretty bright. I actually think I want the Saturn to be a little darker, so I'm going to apply a levels effect to the Saturn, and I'm going to just bring down the white point here. Just kind of bring it down until it's about where I want it. It's right about there, so it's about 3/4 of the way down, and click away. I can also see that this glow here is a little distracting. It's just a little too bright, so we can go find the sun glow here and turn up the feathering a little bit more to right about there and click away. And now our overall scene is looking good. The last thing that I want to add in is a cool color grade. So I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, And we'll rename this adjustment layer color grade and click away. And let's apply a curves effect. Just drop it onto the adjustment layer. So now we can go in here and just maybe push the highlights up a little bit, and we can kind of maybe crush the blacks, just drag down this edge here. And if you wanted to, you could go to the blues and maybe kind of bring up the shadow point just a little bit to kind of make the whole scene maybe just a light purple. And you could even go in and make the blue just have a little bit of a curve to it. Another cool thing that you may want to do, if you go back down to our original Saturn ring layer, you can actually adjust the start and end point of the ramp here to basically go in line with where the sun's location is. So now we can kind of grab these guys here and just kind of line them up with where the sun is coming through, so it makes it just kind of emphasizes how bright the sun really is. And let's go ahead and take a look at our final scene. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you want to learn more about After Effects, creating cool stuff, or just want to get the latest VFX news, go check out my website over at VFX City. This has been Caleb Ward. We'll see you next time.